Well, good morning, everybody. John and I are going to do a little tag team this morning.
All right.
So what we want to talk about this morning are helpful keys to understanding the Gospels. For those of you who do tune in on a regular basis on Sunday, you know that I've been working on some charts of the Gospels, and I have one that goes from the triumphal entry to Gethsemane, and another one that goes from Gethsemane to the last of the resurrection appearances and the ascension. And as I've been working on these charts, it has become very plain to me that there are keys that we can understand to help us put our arms around the Gospels. And so we're going to go through that. We're going to tag team it. And, you know, in some ways, this is a bit more of a technical kind of teaching. It's a different approach than we often do on a Sunday morning. But our vision and our goal is to all come to a much greater understanding of the written word that we have, the access to truth that we have, and to greater understand our Lord Jesus and our Heavenly Father God. So hence the song, Ancient Words, long preserved, that change us and guide us home. So we're going to plunge right in here to the first key to understanding the Gospels. And we put this first because it's so overriding to understanding all four Gospels, and that is to remember the perspectives that Matthew presents Jesus as a king, Mark presents Jesus as a servant, Luke presents Jesus as a man, and John presents Jesus as the Son of God. So John has some great examples to demonstrate those things. So John?
You're muted, John.
Thank you so much. I should be unmuted now. So we're going to get into the four aspects of the Gospels, but in order to do that, what we're going to run into as we do is we're going to see details differ. And I can't tell you how that used to pester me. You know, I would read, for example, when Jesus Christ did his baptism, what God said in Matthew and what God said in Mark and what God said in Luke. And I'm like, and I'm tearing my hair out. And how come there's differences? How come it's not exactly the same in all four Gospels? And as I matured in the word and also matured in my understanding of Eastern customs, the biblical world was much slower than our world. As you know, the no telephones and no emails, and things moved very slowly. Explanations were very involved. And so things were said over and over. They were repeated in various ways, not to mention the fact that both Hebrew and Aramaic, particularly with their verb tenses, are not nearly as crisp as the Greek is or the English is. And so a lot of times you'd have to say something in a couple different ways to be clear about what you were saying. And it's very important that we understand that, because take, for example, the Sermon on the Mount. Now we're thinking about the Sermon on the Mount. It's 3 chapters long, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And I read it out loud to just be sure when I taught you this. You can do the whole Sermon on the Mount in under 20 minutes. If I memorized the Sermon on the Mount, and so you can just see Jesus, well, I am really glad you all are gathered here, you thousands of people, and especially you people that have walked for hours and hours and miles to be here. I have a 20-minute teaching I'd like to give. Thank you very much. No, the Sermon on the Mount went all day. And what we have is we have a compilation, kind of the chewy caramel center of some of the things that are said. And a lot of times what's said in one gospel, if it seems to be different than what's said in another gospel, that in many, many cases, it's that both things were said. And if we're aware of that, and if we try to just piece things together that way, that makes things a lot easier. Another thing that, like Sue said, that makes this very rich is to understand that Matthew presents Jesus as a king, Mark as a servant, Luke as a human being, and the Gospel of John as the Son of God. And there are different things we could look at. For example, the Magi who come to Jerusalem and say, "Where is he who is born King of the Jews?" That only occurs in Matthew. Whereas the shepherds, common people that find out about the birth of the Lord Jesus Christ, that only occurs in Luke. And so as we look at the four gospels, what I want to do is just focus very quickly, because we could literally spend the whole morning just doing differences where Matthew pointed out the king, Mark the servant, and such like that. I just want to point out a few things. Let's go to Matthew chapter 1. And I want to look at the beginning and the ending of the gospels. And notice that in chapter 1 of Matthew 1, it starts out with a scroll of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Well, you'd think, well, that's backwards. Well, it ought to be the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David. What's going on here? And what's going on here again is that Matthew is going to focus on Jesus Christ as the king. And we really have to understand, it's very hard. And I will tell you really honestly, I have not appreciated the term son of David like I have in the last year working with Bill Schlegel as we translate through the Old Testament. And Bill, who taught Hebrew at a Bible college in Israel for 32 years, has such an understanding of the culture and the customs. And if you go back to 2 Samuel chapter 7, it was to King David that God said, "Your kingdom and your dynasty will never end." And everybody knew, at least anybody with spiritual eyes knew, that that didn't mean there was going to be one human king after another forever. Everybody understood that what that meant was there was going to be a series of human kings that would eventually culminate in the Messiah who would reign forever. And so that Messiah became known in the thinking of the people as the Son of David. So when we read the Son of David, what we've got to be thinking about is, number one, this is the continuation of the Messianic kingdom, the kingdom of David, that the people looked for, like you and I look forward to the hope. We look forward to the return of Jesus Christ. They didn't even know Jesus was going to go away. In fact, the disciples, even though Jesus was telling them over and over again, Jesus is going to go away, they didn't get it. But they did understand that when the Son of David came, that his kingdom would last forever. And this becomes very important. If you notice, for example, the kingly authority to heal. Here are the men on the road, on the road to Jericho. Jesus Christ is approaching. The blind men hear the noise. They're like, "What's going on?" Somebody says, "Oh, it's that fellow Jesus is approaching. He's going to walk by on the road." And they didn't say, "Lord Jesus," or Jesus Messiah, or what they said. They said, "Son of David." See, you're the king. You have the authority, the kingly authority. "Son of David, heal us." So Matthew opens up with the Son, Jesus Christ, the Son of David, emphasizing his kingship. Let's go to Mark. If we go to Mark and we go to Mark chapter 1, what we really see is that there's no genealogy at all. And why is this? There's no genealogy because a servant doesn't have a genealogy. A servant is simply hired. So it starts in verse 1, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, and then it starts with a prophecy from Isaiah about the messenger that's going to come before Jesus Christ. We go to Luke. Luke opens up with, again, not immediately a genealogy, but it starts with saying, "Hey, I'm going to write a biography here You know, what do you write biographies about? You write biographies about people. Well, you know, a lot of people have tried, but I'm going to set down the events of the life of this man in an orderly way. And then he starts by introducing the man that's going to introduce the man, Jesus Christ. And that's very cultural. And then by the time you go to Luke chapter 3, there's the genealogy. And where does it start? It starts with Adam and goes down. Actually, it starts with Jesus, but it backs him up all the way to Adam in verse 38 of Luke chapter 3. So Matthew, you have a genealogy going through David, and he's introduced as the son of David. Mark, he's the servant. There's no genealogy. Luke, you have a genealogy going back to Adam, the first man. You guys know the beginning of the Gospel of John, and Jesus Christ is the Son of God. He doesn't, it's his human genealogy is not important. What's important is he's the Son of God that was planned before the foundation of the world. So what do you start with in John? In the beginning was the Logos, the plan. And then in the opening of John, it says, and this plan became flesh and tabernacled among us, and we beheld his glory. And it begins to compare Jesus Christ with the manifestation of God, because that's the way John is going to bring forth Jesus Christ, is the manifestation of God on earth. In the Old Testament, when God really first showed up to dwell among people, other than the Garden of Eden, when he first showed up to dwell among people, where was it? It was in the tabernacle. So it's interesting that when John opens up and it says the plan became flesh, and most versions say and lived among us. The Greek reads and tabernacled among us. And then it says we beheld, and the word behold there is to stare at. And just like the Jews would stare at the tabernacle with the pillar of fire above it during the day, night, and the pillar of cloud during the day, and the glory of the Lord filling the tabernacle, and people would stare at the tabernacle, and it introduces, this is the beginning of Jesus Christ, and he tabernacled among us, and people stared at his glory. And it's introducing Jesus Christ as the Son of God. And you go back then to Matthew, and let's take a look at how the four Gospels end. So in Matthew chapter 28, what do we see? Well, what's a king do? Yeah, a king's going to give orders. And so here in Matthew chapter 8, first of all, in verse 17, Jesus is about to leave. They come and they bow down before him. And Jesus spoke, and he said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, because I'm the king. Verse 19, therefore, and he gives them a command, go and make disciples. So he's commanding them what to do. This is the king. Let's go to Mark. Mark is very interesting. Mark has such a startling end that people invented an end. In fact, I forget, you can look in my commentary and figure it out right away about how many different endings people wrote to the Gospel of Mark. Because it ended so quickly, people thought, well, it must have been, it had to be erased or something. And so they wrote different endings. And that's where you get these weird endings about picking up snakes and drinking poison and that kind of stuff. But Mark chapter 16 ends with the angels, the women come to the grave, they see the stones been rolled back, and then the angels say, you know, you're seeking Jesus, don't be amazed. He's been raised, he's not here. Go tell the disciples and Peter he's going in front of you, you will see him there. And then they ran away from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment seized them. And that's where Mark ends. Why does Mark end like this? Mark ends with just simply an announcement of Christ's resurrection. They don't even see the risen Lord in Mark. It's just an ends with an announcement of his resurrection. Why? Because Mark is portraying Jesus Christ as the servant. You go back into the prophecies in the Old Testament where Jesus Christ is called a servant. And in many, many contexts, he's a suffering servant. You know, Isaiah 53, you know, my servant will be. Isaiah 53 is bracketed with my servant, and he suffers all that. And what do we know about Jesus's ministry? When he died on the cross, that was the end. That was it. That was the end of the suffering servant. There will be no more suffering servant. All the angels had to do is say the suffering servant died, and he's not here, and he's going to do what he said. And then he's going to take over as the king and as the man and as the risen Christ. You go to Luke, and when Luke ends, and here we have Luke is the portraying Christ as the man. And so in Luke, what happens? The man ascends. Verse 50 to 53, and he was parted from them in 51, and the man ascends into heaven. And then his earthly ministry as a man on earth, he fulfilled all that he needed to do, and he ascended into heaven. And then the Gospel of John, the Gospel of John is fascinating in the way it ends. First of all, you have to remember that there's no chapter breaks. And so when the chapter break between 20 and 21 puts a little bit of a dent, if you will, in the understanding of how things end, because in John's ministry, Jesus' ministry in John as the Son of God just continues into eternity. And so what does it say? In verse 30 of John chapter 20, Jesus did many other signs that aren't written. Verse 31, but these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. It's not as important about what he's doing, but that you believe that he's the Messiah so you can live forever. And then it goes on to John chapter 21. And what do you see? You see Jesus Christ continuing his ministry, and then he continues it up through assigning Peter, basically, feed my sheep, before he leaves. And then John verse 24, this is the disciple who's testifying about these things, and they're true. So you can believe in him. So all four gospels, even in the way they begin and the way they end, emphasize the four aspects of Christ's ministry. And there are a lot of other examples that we could bring. And you can read about these in the commentary, which is on Mark 1:1, but we ought to cover some of the other points in here. So Sue, I'll kick it back to you.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to share my screen because I am going to go, let's see. I want to share my entire screen, Rob.
Just leave the top left choice checked. The top left is screen.
Got it. Okay, share. Got it. Thank you. All right. Okay, so this is one of the charts that I did, which a lot of you may have seen before if you were tuned in over the last several weeks. But continuing along this line of thinking about the four Gospels presenting Jesus in different lights, I wanted to point out that in Matthew, and I am, in the Matthew column, and it's Sunday, the 11th of Nisan, and it's at the end of the day. Jesus had left Jerusalem, and he went and he sat on top of the Mount of Olives. And some of the disciples, and Mark gives us the detail of exactly who, come to Jesus and they ask him, what are the sign of your coming and what are the signs of the end times? And Jesus goes into a very lengthy discussion about that. What Matthew includes that is not included in any one of the other Gospels are parables about the kingdom of heaven. He tells two. He tells the parable of the 10 virgins, and that's the one where 5 of them have oil in their lamps and the other 5 didn't think about it and they're unprepared. And they get closed out of the kingdom. And then he tells them the parable of the talents, which is about the 3 servants. One got 5 talents, one got 2 talents, and one got 1 talent. And the servants who got the 5 and the 2 were rewarded for their faithfulness because they put them to use and earned some income. But the other servant buried his because he felt that his master was unjust. And anyway, so the point of the parable is do something with what God gives you. so that you don't get closed out of the kingdom in that way. And then he talked about the sheep and the goat judgment. Again, who gets into the kingdom and who doesn't. So there you have the emphasis on the kingdom in Matthew, and you can see the absence, if you look in the Mark, Luke, and John columns, the absence of any comparable record. In fact, the parables that all start with kingdom of heaven are only found in Matthew. They're not in any of the other gospels. So that's just another example. Here's another one. We'll look at Luke presenting Jesus as the man. And in describing the triumphal entry, Luke is the only gospel that adds the detail that as Jesus came over the Mount of Olives and viewed the city of Jerusalem across the Kidron Valley, that he burst into tears. And Luke is the only, a very human thing. Luke is the only gospel that adds that detail. Something else that became evident to me, and I want you to hold this point loosely. John and I are still looking at it and talking about it, but John, I can't resist mentioning it. When you look at a chart like this, it makes it very plain. Focus your eye on the column of the Gospel of Mark, and as you scroll down and look at it, there's something important to note, and that is, there is not one unique event that occurs only in Mark between the triumphal entry and Gethsemane. And if you look at the other chart, which I'm not going to show you right now, but it's the same kind of thing, the chart that goes from Gethsemane all the way to the final resurrection appearance in the ascension, there isn't a unique record in Mark. Now, we need to do some more study. We think that, we're sure that there are a couple of healings that occur in the Gospel of Mark that don't occur in the other Gospels. But it remains to be seen why that is. But what came to me is that here is the Gospel of Mark. Mark is a servant. Servants don't originate much. They obey. They follow orders. And so here you have this, when you look at the chart, you can see that very clearly in the Gospel of Mark, that there's parallel records in other Gospels in a case, especially in the time frame between the triumphal entry and the final meeting before the ascension. Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is unique in presenting the I am statements of Jesus. Those don't occur in the other Gospels. So here he is declaring himself as the Son of God in many different ways. In John 6, I am the bread of life. John 8, I am the light of the world. John 10, I am the door. I'm the good shepherd. I am the Son of God. John 11, I am the resurrection and the life. That was the raising of Lazarus. In John 14, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And in John 15, I am the true vine. So just more examples of things to watch for as you're reading the Gospels and the uniqueness of each one, details of the nature of Christ. Somebody has a nice dog. And that kind of brings us to the second principle or key that we wanted to talk about, was that, and John mentioned this a little bit in his introduction, the nature of the Hebrew language and the culture of the Hebrews is not so much hung up on chronology as the Western cultures are. We Westerners are very, very concerned with sequence and order and things being chronologically presented. And it can cause some frustration sometimes as you're reading the Gospels and trying to figure out what is the chronology, because oftentimes in the Hebrew culture, it just wasn't that important. And so John and I have some examples of that. Where are the places in the Gospels where things are out of chronology by intention? So John?
Actually, Sue, if you want to go first on this one, that would be great.
Oh, okay. All right. That's great. Well, turn to Matthew 26, and I'm going to go back to my screen share. And we'll do this. Okay, so I'm back in the chart that covers from the triumphal entry to Gethsemane. I'm going to scroll down in the chart to a particular place in Matthew 26, but I want to read it with you. So in Matthew 26, starting in verse 1, and you can see if you're reading in the REV, the heading is the plot to kill Jesus. So it came to pass when Jesus had finished all these words, he said to his disciples, "You know that after 2 days the Passover is coming and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." Mm-hmm. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the courtyard of the high priest, the one called Caiaphas, and they plotted together in order to arrest Jesus by stealth and then kill him. But they were saying, "Not during the feast, lest there be a riot among the people." Then jump down to verse 14. And this is Judas's plot to betray Jesus. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, having gone to the chief priests, said, "What are you willing to give me if I hand him over to you?" And they weighed out to him 30 pieces of silver. And from then on, he was watching for an opportunity to hand him over to them. What is sandwiched in the middle of those two records? When Jesus was in Bethany, and we know that Jesus was in Bethany from Thursday night to Monday evening, when he went into Jerusalem, or Monday late afternoon, when he went into Jerusalem for the Last Supper. So at some point when Jesus was in Bethany, when he was in Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, a woman came to him having an alabaster flask of very costly perfume, and she poured it on his head as he was reclining to eat. But having seen this, the disciples were indignant, saying, "Why this waste? For it would have been possible to sell this for a high price and the money given to the poor." But Jesus, perceiving it, said to them, "Why do you trouble the woman? She has worked a good work on me. For you always have the poor with you, but you do not always have me. For this woman, having poured this perfume on my body, she did it to prepare me for burial." So when did this really occur, this sandwiched in record of the anointing? If you look at the chart, it looks like it happened on Sunday, the 11th of Nisan, toward the end of the day. It didn't. It happened before the triumphal entry on Thursday night when Jesus first came to Bethany. So what's it doing here in Matthew 26? And you can also see that it's in Mark 14 as well, out, in the same kind of presentation, location in the Gospel of Mark as in Matthew. What's it doing in there? Well, the point was that he's going to die and be buried. And by the way, he had been anointed by this woman, and it was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper. Now, how do I know that it happened not at this point, but, that it happened earlier is the Gospel of John. And if you go to the Gospel of John, chapter 12, John anchors this event with very specific time words. 6 days before the Passover, I'm in verse 1, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus raised out from among the dead. So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, and Lazarus was one of those who was reclining to eat with him. Then Mary, having taken 3/4 pound of expensive perfume made from pure nard, anointed the feet of Jesus and wiped his feet with her hair. and the house was filled with the fragrance of the ointment. And then Judas complained about it. We learned from John that the perfume has a price. But Jesus says in verse 7, therefore Jesus said, leave her alone. She has kept this until now for the day of my burial. For the poor you always have with you, but you don't always have me. And then if you look down in verse 12, on the next day, and it goes on as explaining the triumphal entry. So it's, stop sharing here. It's evident, from John about the timing and all of that. And you would have to ask yourself, does it make any sense that there were two anointings with exactly the same perfume, with exactly the same price on the perfume? And we know that it was a woman and it was in the house of Simon the leper. Well, it doesn't make any sense. And that's why we're able to place it differently chronologically. But that's an example of where in Matthew and Luke, it's just inserted where it's pertinent as opposed to when in time it occurred. So John, that was my example of that.
Yeah, there's a lot of examples, and one of the, this is really something that can throw people off. Like Sue said, and I can testify to this personally because I like things to be in chronological order. I like to know what happened. And the other side of that question is when something's not in chronological order, almost never, and I can't even think of a good example, but almost never does it explain in scripture why that is. And it's fascinating that when you look at the four gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and Matthew portrays Christ as a king, Matthew is the most out of order of all of the gospels. So there are kind of kingly events and kingly responsibilities that God reorders for us to emphasize certain points of Christ's kingly ministry. Interestingly enough, this is slightly reflected in the kingly life of David. If you read the book of about David in Samuel and First Kings and in First Chronicles, there are things in David's life that are out of order as well. And by the way, while we're talking about that, like Sue said, the Hebrews thought completely differently about order than you and I do. But example, Jeremiah. If we go to the book of Jeremiah, you start in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 2, it's the 13th year of Josiah. It's like, okay, so we have Josiah, then we have Jehoahaz, and then we have Jehoiakim, and then we have Jehoiachin, and we have the last king of Judah, Zedekiah. So we know the kings. It's like, okay, so Jeremiah now he starts in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah. That's when the word first comes to him. And we start reading through Jeremiah and we get until chapter 21. And all of a sudden we skip Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin. And we, in chapter 21, we go from Josiah to Zedekiah, the last king. But then in chapter 25, we go back 2 kings to Jehoiakim. Then in 27, we go forward 2 kings to Zedekiah again. Then in 35, we go back 2 kings to Jehoiakim. Then in 37, we go forward 2 kings to Zedekiah. And then we go back and forth. And it's like, if you're not paying attention to who the king is, then you get lost. And so that kind of chronology is reflected, and in the 4 gospels, it's reflected the most in the book of Matthew. And it would take a full teaching and more to go through this. But for example, in Matthew chapter, as you read through, you get to Matthew chapter 4, verse 18 to 22. He's calling the 4 disciples. And the next thing you read in Matthew is the healing of Peter's, the next thing, the next event is the healing of Peter's mother-in-law when she was sick of a fever. And in Mark and Luke, the chronology is perfect. In Matthew, you go to from chapter 4 to chapter 8. Then by the time you get up a few more events, you're back in Matthew chapter 4. Then nicely, you go to Matthew chapter 5. But then you go back to Matthew chapter 8. And then nicely, you go to chapter 9, except then you go to Matthew chapter 12 and so on. So just understanding that some of the events are out of chronological order is one of the reasons why it's so important to have charts and to think through things like Sue's done with her charts when you're reading the four gospels. And when Luke starts out and says, I'm going to set in order the things of the life of Christ, scholars have long recognized that the Gospel of Luke, although it's not perfectly in chronological order, is the most chronological of any of the four Gospels, which again, that makes perfect sense if Luke is being portrayed as a man, because in a biography, you want to be able to see the development of the man through time. So you want that biography to be pretty much in chronological order, which it is. But just so we're aware that the Hebrews and the biblical world did not think about chronological order as cleanly as you and I do, just so we're not thrown off by that. And then we can begin to look for meaning in why God places certain events where he does. What's the emphasis he's looking for? Sometimes that can be fairly easy to discover, and sometimes we're still looking for the meaning. Why did you do this? It can be tough to sort out. So Sue, on to the next point.
Yeah. So the next one we wanted to cover was, how do you determine, in light of the fact that it's not always chronological, how do you determine, just like with the question of the anointing of Jesus before the triumphal entry, how do you determine whether it really is two events or whether it's one event given with different details? And the answer to that just has a lot to do with what's reasonable. Like, it isn't reasonable that Jesus would have been anointed twice in the same place, in the same house, with exactly the same kind of perfume, with exactly the dollar value of the perfume. So what is reasonable? So we have some examples of this. John, you want to do blind Bartimaeus, or do you want me to do fig tree?
No, I'd love to. Let's do blind Bartimaeus. And I will tell you that this, of all of the gospel records and trying to figure out what is going on here, this one is by far and away one of the most difficult. And I, again, am thankful to Bill Schlegel and his ministry and teaching, because I was completely stuck on this one. But let's go to Matthew. And this is the healing of blind Bartimaeus, which actually, we only call it the healing of blind Bartimaeus because he's the person that's mentioned in Mark. If we go to Matthew chapter 20, and we start in verse 29, we're paying attention to time words, and it says, as they were going out from Jericho. Now, that's one of those details. Okay, let's pay attention. They were going out from Jericho. A great multitude followed him, and look, two blind men sitting by the side of the path, when they heard that Jesus was passing by, cried out saying, Lord, watch this, Son of David, you're the king, you have the authority. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. And here Matthew's going to say it's two blind men. When Jesus Christ healed the men that were possessed by demons, afflicted by demons, who lived on the east side of the Sea of Galilee, Matthew says there were two of them. Mark and Luke both say only one. So it's pretty common for Matthew to focus on the number of people. Mark and Luke have a different focus. They're focusing on the action. The servant, the man, focuses on the action. The king, in charge of his subjects, focusing on the number. Here's two blind men. They're sitting by the path. They hear that Jesus is passing by. Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Verse 11, the multitude rebuked them. That didn't work. They cried out all the more, Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us. Jesus stood still, called them, and said, what do you want me to do? I love that, because it's like, duh, they say, Lord, let our eyes be opened. Jesus, being moved with compassion, touched their eyes. Immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Mark is very similar, except Mark just mentions one man and names him Bartimaeus. In Aramaic, Bar is son of, so that's why it's son of Timaeus. But let's go to Luke chapter 18, because this is what threw me in verse 35. The details are the same except for verse 35. It came to pass as he drew near Jericho, a certain blind man sat by the road begging. Wait a minute. In Matthew and Mark, he's leaving Jericho. Here, he hasn't even arrived at Jericho yet. I'm pulling my hair out at this point, going, now the rest of it makes sense that it's only one record. I mean, there's a multitude, they inquire, what does this mean? Well, Jesus is walking by. The man cries out, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. The crowds rebuke him, so he'd be quiet. That didn't work. He cries out all the more, son of David, have mercy. Jesus stood still, commanded him to be brought. What do you want me to do? I want to receive my sight. And immediately he receives his sight and follows Jesus' glory. The parallel is flawless, except in Matthew and Mark, Jesus has not reached Jericho yet. And in Mark, he is gone through, Matthew, Mark, he hasn't reached Jericho yet. And then, he has gone and he's going through that. Okay, rewind. In Matthew and Mark, he's reached Jericho and is going through it. He's leaving Jericho. And in Luke, he hasn't even reached Jericho yet. And I'm like, wow, what do you do with that contradiction? And it's actually pretty simple to figure out. There's two Jerichos. There's a New Testament Jericho. There's an Old Testament Jericho. The Old Testament Jericho is about 1.5 miles to the northeast of New Testament Jericho. That becomes very important because Jesus Christ was on his way to Jerusalem from Perea, which is on the east side of the Jordan River. So Christ has to cross the Jordan River and then he's got to move west. And as he's moving west, the first thing he does is he walks through the town of Old Testament Jericho. Now, from Matthew's perspective, and Matthew lives in Israel, he's a Jew. Matthew is not a Greek. Matthew is a Jew. He was working for the Romans, but he was a Jew. And to Matthew, Jericho is the traditional Old Testament Jericho. And so Jesus was walking out of that Old Testament Jericho. But to Luke, who's a Greek and Roman citizen, Jericho is where the king lives, which is King Herod Antipas. Well, Herod the Great had his palace there, but then later on it was taken over by Herod Antipas. The administrative center and the palace of the king was New Testament Jericho. And they were walking through Old Testament Jericho. They hadn't reached New Testament Jericho yet. So when Matthew says, well, they're walking out of Jericho, they were walking out of Old Testament Jericho, the traditional Jericho, the Jericho of the book of Joshua that everybody thought of when they thought of Jericho. Luke, they're going into Jericho. Yeah, New Testament Jericho, where the king was, the new city that had been built, the administrative center. And then other than that, the record is perfectly the same. So Jesus is coming east to west. He walks through Old Testament Jericho. On the road between the two Jerichos, here are these blind men, and Jesus heals them. And then Jesus walks into New Testament Jericho, which is, by the way, where he's going to meet Zacchaeus, the chief tax collector, who's up in a tree. So understanding the geography there helps us put the two records together. We can tell from the details they're only one record. We've just got to put them together to where they fit. And you can do that if you understand the geography in this case.
Cool. I'm going to share my screen and show you on the chart another example of a puzzle to be solved. Let's see, that way. Okay. So this one, this is kind of the puzzle of the fig trees. Were there two trees or were there one? This is in Matthew and Mark. And if you look at the chart on Saturday, the 10th of Nisan, which was the Sabbath, and look in Mark, the green highlighted cell, in the morning, going from Bethany into Jerusalem, Jesus was hungry and he walked up to a fig tree that had nothing on it but leaves, and he cursed the fig tree. Then he went into the temple, and this was the time when he cleansed the temple and cast out the buyers, overturned the tables, and so forth. And that record is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Then in Mark, the next morning, so at the end of cleansing the temple, they went back out of Jerusalem to Bethany, spent the night, and came back into Jerusalem the next morning. So this would have been early in the day on the 11th of Nisan, Sunday. So the next morning in Mark, the fig tree was withered. And Jesus taught them. In Mark, it says that the disciples heard it when he said the night before, curse the tree. And then the next morning when they came by and saw it withered, Peter remembered his words and spoke out and said, look, the fig tree is withered. And Jesus taught them about faith. And that was when he said, if you believe, say to this mountain, be cast in the sea, it will be done for you. Now look at the column in Matthew. What happened as Matthew records it, is Jesus cleansed the temple on Saturday, left Jerusalem for Bethany. The next morning, he was walking into Jerusalem and he was hungry, and he saw a fig tree that had no fruit on it, only leaves, and he cursed the tree, and the tree withered immediately. It's a very important detail that's given in Matthew. So what do we have? And then, by the way, in Matthew, he taught the same teaching about the mountain being cast into the sea. Is it two teachings? Is it two trees? Is it one tree and one of the two gospels got the detail wrong? Not at all. There were two trees, one teaching. And when you have a chart like this, you can see it. I'm for sake of time, I'm not going to actually go to the records and read them to you, but doing a chart like this really helps you, and it grabs your attention on time words and location and what day it is and all of that. So the last thing we want to talk about in terms of understanding the Gospels is statements that occur in the Gospels that are what we might call collapsed chronology, or statements where a narrative is interrupted and it's like some narrator inserts a bunch of perspective or comments about stuff. So John, do you want to run with that?
Yeah, a couple different things. When talking about collapsed chronologies, this one of the places this really is difficult is at the resurrection appearances of Christ and even the trial of Jesus Christ. For example, we know if you read Luke, the Gospel of Luke, Jesus Christ is before Pilate until Pilate hears that Jesus is a Galilean. At that point, Pilate is like, wow, this is great. I didn't want to deal with this to begin with. And he sends Jesus to Herod. Herod mocks Jesus and tries to get him to talk, but this is Herod Antipas, who had executed John the Baptist not too many months earlier. So Jesus isn't going to say a word to Herod Antipas, and he doesn't. Finally, Herod Antipas gets fed up with the whole thing and sends him back to Pilate. So from the Gospel of Luke, we get a very, very clear picture of, again, Luke setting forth the chronology accurately, just like he said in Luke chapter 1. Jesus before Pilate, Jesus before Herod, Jesus back before Pilate. And you have time frames that help us out with this. If you read the other three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it's just Herod's not even mentioned. It's just one trial before Pilate. And then it's up to us to sort out, like when you're reading what I would call the conflated, the put together record in, say, Matthew, part of what's in Matthew is the earlier trial, part of what's in Matthew is the later trial. And at least we believe that. It's very possible it's actually all the later trial. And there's nothing in Matthew from the earlier trial, but there seems to be. So then you have to say, okay, if there is an insertion here where Jesus went to Herod, where would it occur? What's the earlier trial? What's the later trial? We run into the same thing when the angels talk to the women. If you put all four gospels, side by side in chart form, like Sue has done, then you can see, okay, here this angel talks to this woman, then this other event occurs, then this other event occurs, and then we're back in the same gospel. But if you just simply read the four gospels one after another, the events get stuck together. And it's and sometimes when this happens, one of the things that can be confusing is where the narrator takes over and where does the dialogue between the biblical characters stop. And I'd like to go to John chapter 3, because this is one of the more important of those to know about. So let's go to John chapter 3. And here's Jesus talking to Nicodemus. And so Nicodemus is a Pharisee. He's come to Jesus at night and he wants to know, you're a teacher come from God. And Jesus says, unless you're born from above, you won't enter the kingdom of God. And Jesus and Nicodemus begin a dialogue. And if you have a red letter Bible, like here's my red letter NIV, Jesus starts talking in verse 5 and talks all the way until 21. And that in my red letter Bible is the dialogue of Jesus Christ. But if you look at the verb tenses and you look at the content of what was said, Jesus Christ stopped speaking in verse 12. And verse 13 to verse 21 should be the narrator, not Jesus Christ. And if we make this narrator, if we turn him into Jesus, then a lot of things are kind of kittywampus. For one thing, verse 13 says, no one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man. And we know that in this case, the better manuscripts say, except the Son of Man who is in heaven. Now, why did that phrase get omitted? Because the scribes thought, well, wait a minute, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus. He can't be in heaven and talking to Nicodemus at the same time. So they omitted the phrase. But if we understand this is where the narrator took over, then Jesus Christ is speaking to Nicodemus and said, how will you believe if I speak to you of heavenly things? That's the last thing he says. The narrator takes over. No one has ever gone into heaven except the one who came from heaven, the Son of Man who is in heaven, because by that time he ascended. Verse 14, just as Moses lifted up the snake in the desert, so the Son of Man, and must be, can be, was lifted up, that everyone who believes in him may have everlasting life. For God so loved the world that he gave, past tense, they got that right, his one and only Son. Well, wait a minute. If Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, he hasn't been given yet. He hasn't given his life yet. That whosoever believes should not perish. Verse 17, and then it explains why the Son came, and whosoever believes in him is not condemned. And it goes on from there. So it's very important that we get the speeches right with the narrator, because the narrator's incessantly inserting a commentary that helps us out. And if we do that, then it really helps us understand the four gospels and get them into our minds better so we can figure out what's going on. So that is my example about paying attention to the narrator.
The Gospel of John is loaded with those kind of examples. And I have one in John 12 real quickly, and this is it. We'll kind of wrap it up with this one. But in John 12, which that chapter begins with the triumphal entry. But then by the time you get to verse 36, it's the end of Sunday, the 11th of Nisan, and Jesus went and hid himself. He had been teaching in the temple, and we learned from the other Gospels, he confronted the Pharisees publicly, and then he talked to the multitudes after the Pharisees got disgusted and left. And then he talked to the 12, and he sat with the 12, and they across from the treasury, and they watched the woman cast her 2 leptons into the treasury. And then he spoke a little bit more, and then he left. And we learn from John 36 that he left and went and hid himself. But then in verse 37, it starts this long dialogue that goes to the end of the chapter. But although he had done so many signs before them, yet they didn't believe. And it goes on and talks about the unbelief of the Jews. And then it talks about the world judging and so forth. And as you read this, it's like, wait a minute, he just left and he didn't talk anymore after that, according to the other gospels. But here's this long thing. It's like a narrator's insertion. John and I played around with what do you call this? And that was probably the best phrase we came up with. That it's, you take a step back and it's another voice chiming in with perspective, with explanation, with summary ideas, and so forth. So that's a little bit about chronology and narrator's insertions. And John, I think that's a good place to.
Yeah, I just want to, yeah, it is. That's a good place to stop. I just want to kind of conclude by summarizing and saying the point of this is to help us understand and read the four Gospels with confidence and not with frustration. Because I think that one thing that is lacking in the Christian world is people really taking the time to read the Bible. We take time to watch our favorite TV show. We take time to do a lot of different things. It really is incumbent upon us as Christians to take time to read the Gospels the Bible. And the four Gospels are such a wonderful thing to read because it does portray Jesus. And frankly, it takes effort because there's a value in, say, taking the Gospel of Matthew and just reading it straight through, taking the Gospel of Mark and just reading it straight through, and taking a half hour a day or an hour a day and just reading. But then there's value. And also when you're reading through Mark and you hit a record, you go, I'm going to read this in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and see the details and get the fullness of the event and what really happened. But giving this teaching this morning is very much a plea from Sue and I to the Christian world to spend more time reading the Bible and mark and make notes on what you don't understand. If you don't understand anything, there are people who do and that can help you. And when you understand something and that comes together, the Bible becomes more fun to read, more exciting to read, and it has more of a personal impact on your life. I was thinking about the prophecies this morning and how, God really does speak to us so that we will change. The Bible is for guidance. And so we will change to become like Christ. But it's hard to change and become like Christ if you don't know what Christ was like, if you don't know what he did, how he lived, and that kind of thing. So getting rid of frustration and developing an understanding when we read the Gospels, or in fact the whole Bible, then helps us to read it, be excited about it, be blessed with it. Then we can change, become like Christ, and be those helpful hands and feet that God needs in the world. So thank you so much for being with us, and the floor is wide open for discussion.